College, and he will be presenting Teaching with Virtues through Incorporating Supplemental Instruction. And I'm just going to pass out an attendance sheet, and then before the end of the session, I'll ask you to fill out an evaluation form. Okay, so welcome.
Thank you. So I'm Greg Sadler, and I teach philosophy. I've taught some religious studies classes as well at various places, but mainly just philosophy, especially critical thinking and ethics classes. I've used supplemental instruction in two ways. One where it was officially supplemental instruction, where we made pretty extensive use of it for my critical thinking classes, where we had a very high DFW rate. That was D's, F's, and withdrawals.
Oh,
so that's a measure of how students are doing with the class. It was a required class. Any class that had a high DFW rate got supplemental instruction resources at Fayetteville State University. My job before that, I taught actually at Indiana State Prison in a 4-year degree program. And we didn't have supplemental instruction, but what we did have was a very strong community of education there, because men were, there for a long time, had gone through the program, would counsel each other a bit, would lead each other, and we actually had dedicated tutors while that program lasted that we instructors could work with pretty directly. So when this conference was brought up and I was asked, do you want to think about contributing anything, I thought, well, what could I bring in terms of philosophy? And so I'm not going to talk a lot about pedagogy per se. I'm going to talk about how one moral theory that we call virtue ethics could intersect with some of the things that we talk about in scholarship and teaching and learning a little bit more thematically. And what I've done actually is I've written a paper that I'm still working on, so I'm going to read the paper. We could stop at different points if you want to, and do questions, or we could just wait until the end and then have a long discussion about it. Does that sound good? Okay, so the thing that I want to think about is what sorts of skills and dispositions do we need to attend to think about, to cultivate, in order to render supplemental instruction a highly effective pedagogical resource. And the first three answers to this question that are the most likely ones are things like disciplinary knowledge, or pedagogical competency, or this broad category that we often label as people skills. It's not something like, well, we have to think about a moral theory, we have to think about ethics, or anything like that. What I'm going to talk about here is one particular kind of moral theory that we call virtue ethics, and I'm going to talk about another type of set of skills and dispositions, the virtues that we call intellectual and moral. So for about the next 25 minutes or so, and since you've committed to me reading the paper, I'm going to be sketching out a broadly Aristotelian virtue ethics framework, and I'm going to say that supplemental instruction could be profitably located within this and further thought out in conjunction with it. So what I'm not saying, actually I want to make this very clear right off the bat, is that this would be some sort of substitute for any of the other things that we want to think about or do. So I'm not saying let's replace training that's very attentive, say, to study skills or things like that with virtue ethics. But I think it could be a good adjunct, something that would complement what we're thinking about. So multiple sets of skills and dispositions are needed or desirable for both instructors and students who are supplemental instruction leaders or coaches. Expertise in an academic discipline and what happens to be the subject matter is one of three important things that we normally look at. That almost goes without saying, but I think it's worth dwelling on this, because one of the prevalent misconceptions that we have to disabuse our students of so often is that learning and expertise is largely just a matter of acquiring information rather than acquiring and developing a battery of skills. Some of these are general, like written communication or critical thinking, others very specific to the subject matters, but often susceptible of transfer and analogy to other contexts. That's what we want them to get. Even deeper than skills and equally important are what we call dispositions, developed habits, general attitudes, outlooks and approaches, affective orientations, patterns of desire, and emotional response. In one of the main fields that I work in, critical thinking, that field of performance and expertise has long been identified by one of the most rigorous disciplinary models in self-studies, the APA Delphi report about critical thinking, as consisting specifically in skills and then dispositions, not just skills. Within a classical Aristotelian philosophy of education, an assemblage of interlocking and scaffolded knowledges, skills, and dispositions has a particular name. They call that a hexis or a habitus. Terms, Greek and Latin terms, have been used in some other contexts. They become sort of like a possession rooted in the being of the knower, and when they're developed, we call this an intellectual virtue. So that's some of the terminology. If you hear me talking about virtue and you say, I don't know, what's he talking about there? That sounds awfully moralistic. When we talk about a virtue, we mean some type of excellence. But what is an excellence? It's something that one does over and over again. It's rooted within one. It's not just something that one does occasionally, if it's one's excellence. Now, as all of us know, some of us having been schooled by painful experience, there's an art and expertise whose product is consistently teaching well. And this is different from, although it does bear affinities with certain types of disciplinary expertise, say mathematics or philosophy or history. One can be a great scholar in a particular field, and yet teach material that one knows in ways that are confusing, uninformative, even inscrutable to one's students. You've all seen instructors like that, or perhaps at one point, I'll cop to this myself, having been that student. So this is the second kind of skills and desirable dispositions, and it's susceptible of being taught, even formalized to certain systems and to some degree. Then there's this broad category of things that we call people skills, and that I understand it's a very vague category to invoke, and we're not going to actually go into it in any sort of detail here. And the reason I'm bringing it up is to contrast that with another set of skills and dispositions that we study in ethics that we call the virtues. Now, an ideal instructor develops and possesses, exhibits, integrates, and models all of these sort of things all of the time. Real instructors like ourselves, of course, do these more or less well, more or less consistently, stronger in some areas at particular times, in certain types of situations and others, hopefully improving on the way, reflecting on good or bad experiences, adding to our areas of strength and expertise through theoretical study, like scholarship and teaching and learning, interaction with our peers, like what we're doing here, appropriating useful or engaging resources, like some of the things we get here as well, putting things into practice, and then reassessment, this constant process of improvement. As a result, or better put, through these processes, education occurs. Learning takes place within, through, and by students more or less successfully. Hopefully the students come out of our classes not only having learned disciplinary information at a surface level, but a deeper, more retentive level that's signified when we talk about a habitus. So this, again, nothing really surprising here, just maybe a little bit of terminology that's different from one way of looking at it to another. They might have also developed some competencies in pedagogy themselves, depending on what you're doing with them. Or, that you may have worked on these sort of broad people skills things, communication skills, ability to empathize with other people. Adding an SI leader or any sort of intermediary, like a teaching assistant or a tutor, renders these matters more complex. Since the intermediary functions as an instructor, albeit at a different level and in different ways, and as a student, albeit a student with a higher, more integrated grasp of the course material. There's also the question of the degree to and the ways which the instructor teaches, interacts with, and fosters the development of the SI leader, and the feedback about or insight into the students provided to the instructor by the SI leader, who has a unique and useful vantage point from which to observe and interact with students. So with this more complex and potentially more productive arrangement outlined, now we can raise the question of whether what is going on, or what could potentially be going on, what ought to be going on, and what we as instructors would like to be going on, because these aren't always the same thing, can be adequately conceptualized just in terms of disciplinary knowledge, pedagogical expertise, and people skills. So what I'm trying to say here is that you can do that, and many of us do that, but that adding a virtue ethics perspective would contribute something more. Not something that you're going to be able to directly measure I suspect. There actually is some work being done in assessment of moral development, especially in the Northeast with some pilot studies that are going on, but I'm not going to go into that here because I'm aware of but not familiar with that research. So all of these are important. But I would like to say that, and to some extent say why and how, thinking about SI in terms of the family of approaches in moral theory that we call virtue ethics, contributes to developing a yet more adequate understanding of what still more effective use of SI would look like. So before doing these things, I want to reiterate once again some of the things I'm actually saying and some of the things I'm not, because I find that when I talk about ethics, one of the byproducts is often people get upset and say, "Who are you to be pushing this sort of thing?" And there's a lot of controversy about that. So I'm saying that virtue ethics provides a needed complement to other more explicitly pedagogical and less explicitly moral theoretical approaches. I'm not suggesting that virtue ethics is in any way a substitute for these other approaches. I'm also not saying that the instructor whose disciplinary competence lies in some other field now needs to become a moral philosopher and start doing that sort of thing full time. I am saying that some of the typical components of a virtue ethics approach can be adopted and appropriated as useful portions of one's own approach to effective employment of SI leaders. And I think these components do that in two ways. There are some ideas or considerations that a virtue ethics approach provides that are unlikely to be provided or even realized as needed in its absence. And then there's also a lot of ideas and considerations that are always on the table, but often don't get the emphasis that they probably could use because our other approaches are focused on other ends, other measures, other interests. So what I plan to do in this talk, before opening up the floor to have whatever we want to do, discussion, we can ask questions, we can have dialogue, I'm going to try to do four things very quickly. One of them is to give a very brief overview of virtue ethics as a kind of moral theory. Then I'm going to look at the purposes of SI within that sort of framework. After that, I'm going to discuss which virtues and vices are important to focus on to ensure effective use of SI. And then I'm going to talk very, very briefly about how these are actually developed, what we might want to think about in terms of our SI leaders in their own development. So what is virtue ethics? I'm guessing that this is a term that most of you encountered at one point along the line in your education in taking an intro to philosophy class or an ethics class. You may have studied it more or less extensively, but if you're like my students, then you've probably actually retained the name, but not entirely the idea. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of terms that we learn along the way, and then we forget exactly where they fit in. So virtue ethics is one of the main well-established and coherent moral theories which we teach in various ethics and applied ethics courses. It represents a family of moral theories. So it includes, say, Plato and Aristotle's theories. It also includes some non-Western theories like that of Confucius. It also includes those who have interpreted them down to the modern day. So it would include contemporary philosophers like Martha Nussbaum or Alistair McIntyre, if you're familiar with them. One of the distinctive features shared by all of these various virtue ethics in this family is making virtues and vices, or the array of good and bad moral dispositions that are developed over time as habits through actions and choices, of central consideration in evaluating the goodness or badness, the rightness or wrongness, the appropriateness or inappropriateness of actions and other things. So virtue ethics is different in that it doesn't look immediately at actions, it looks at states of character and sort of shifts the focus. Instead of focusing just on conformity to rules or following moral or professional codes or calculating best outcomes or displaying compassion or even on other broad ethical principles, virtue ethics goes beyond and situates all of these in relation to three other sets of matters. One is reframing, thinking about these things in terms of human flourishing, excellence, and then means and ends. One is identifying the actual ranges of habits and dispositions we want to look at, the virtues and the vices. and then the other thing is actually thinking about how are these fostered, how are these brought about. So it makes good sense to start by stepping back momentarily and asking a few questions. Many of us routinely ask these sort of questions, similar in intent, though different in scope, as part of our work as educators. When carrying out integrated course design, for example, or this goes by many different names, the basic idea is you start by thinking about what you actually want to achieve, and then you start looking at the means in order to attain that, and the means in order to attain that. Backwards design, it's also called. When you're doing that, you're doing what we call practical reasoning. So we're going to do that here, and we can broaden the horizons of this sort of questioning when it comes to SI. And this is what virtue ethics actually does when it comes to education. It asks, what is the purpose? What are the goods achieved by? What are the goods necessary as conditions for? What is the end of education? What counts as excellence when it comes to teaching, when it comes to learning? And asking and attempting to answer these kinds of questions opens up even bigger questions, which we're going to avoid here, but just notice. We can ask this about an SI leader. We can ask, what is the purpose of an SI leader? Often this gets left out. I didn't put this in the paper, but one of my experiences in having an SI leader was having them suddenly thrust upon me and say, here's the resource, you got to use them. And then you start thinking, well, how am I going to integrate this into my class? I've already got my syllabus formed. And so the first semester, my SI leader, and it's mainly my fault, was pretty useless. And these sort of things only get better when we think about these sorts of questions. How are we going to integrate them? Well, answering that depends on what you want an SI leader to actually do. And that's not just a matter of purely personal choice or ad hoc things you come up with on the fly. You probably should actually sit down and think, what is the actual purpose of this? What are we doing this for? What are the goods they're instrumental in producing? What constitutes excellence in their specific type of educational activity? Now, a number of varied purposes come to mind when we ask why we have and how we can use an SI leader. The broadest, most overarching one is, of course, to improve student learning in our courses. What does that mean, and how does that take determinate form? This came up earlier today in that session when people started asking about assessment. That's one way of looking at it, right? How can we actually tell whether this is doing any good, whether we're just throwing money away, as the administrators sometimes see it. How does that take determinate form? Well, at the very least, SI leaders provide contact hours in addition to our own class time, and often little used office hours, during which students are engaging with the course material. They also provide much more individuated hands-on instruction for students who attend their sessions. They cover the material, sometimes from different vantage points. Same material, but looked at in a different way can suddenly open it up for a student. They provide additional examples or applications needed to help students wrap their heads around course concepts. So that what they're doing is they're supporting and extending the teaching built into the course, structured by the instructor. Like course instructors, SI leaders help students progress towards what is the central good, the goods of knowledge, whether pursued for merely instrumental reasons or towards intrinsic values. What is distinctive to SI leaders as opposed to tutors or TAs, other intermediaries, is two things. They're all undergraduate students at that institution, which could be the case for a tutor, but rarely the case for a TA, right? They're on more or less the same level as the students with whom they're engaged, and more specifically, they're students who excelled in that particular course with that particular professor. Both of these provide SI leaders with distinct advantages in reaching and assisting students. They're regarded as peers of a sort, as living examples that and how one can excel in a course taught by a particular professor. So they're viewed as particularly well-informed, not just about a given subject in general, but in a more specific way, how their assigned professor structures the course, teaches the material, evaluates student performance. These are often the things students are asking our SI leaders, at least in my experience, about. How's the grading going to take place? So what makes an SI leader excellent? We instructors need to know this, not only so we can recognize when we're fortunate enough to have excellent SI leaders, but also so we can steer the SI leaders we recruit towards the needed forms and dimensions of excellence. And one example that I give here in rethinking this is, you might suppose that the greater and quicker mastery a potential SI leader demonstrates of course material, the more effective he or she will be, but that's not necessarily so. In some respects, it's far better to employ an SI leader who, while intelligent, has struggled at some points or in certain manners with the material, since such a student now teaching possesses an affective and intellectual grasp of the starting condition of many students, some understanding of what's required to go beyond that, and an ability to model the means and possibility of success to their peers. Ideally, you would want an SI leader to be continuing their own education in the subject matter. So if it's a beginning level critical thinking class like the one that I taught, I would want an SI leader to be continuing on and studying some additional things outside of the class that fall within that, so that they are growing. You want them to be expanding their expertise, discerning their own weak points and working on those, deepening their understanding. SI leaders need to be good students, already doing well and on an established trajectory towards further improvement, and likewise they need to be developing teachers. Towards developing excellence in these two roles, and in the particular combination, SI leaders require some degree of development of one intellectual virtue that we identify in the Aristotelian way as phronesis, or another translation, practical wisdom. The ability to go beyond the rules, go beyond procedures, and see what needs to be applied to particular cases. And that's something that has to be developed over time. It doesn't come automatically. It's not just a knack that people have. It's something that is a habit. They're also going to require, I'm going to say, some development and understanding of the moral virtues, certain moral virtues. So what are moral virtues? They're habitual dispositions that are gradually, by practice, established within a person's character or personality. They take the form of typically and characteristically acting, feeling, making use of things in good or right ways. And the person who is virtuous possesses right assessments and attitudes towards what's to be done, what goods are at stake, and how they ought best to be ordered or pursued or produced or protected. So possession and practice of the virtues, again in virtue ethics, is what enables a person to flourish in determinate ways, what enables them to realize their potential and to aid others in flourishing as well and realizing their own potential. Since Aristotle's own time, it's been recognized that these tend to be intermediate states, and that the other types of habits that we want to avoid, we call vices, tend to be extreme states. A few other things need to be said about this notion of virtue. It's possible for a person to do virtuous actions without him or herself being actually virtuous, that is, having it established in their character. So one might act in the way a virtuous person would, as just or moderate or honest or courageous, but just on occasion. That's not yet having virtue. One might behave consistently in the way virtuous people tend to, but not because one chooses that, recognizing that that's the right thing to do or that it's good for its own sake, but just to earn a reward or avoid a punishment or something like that. You can even recognize the goodness of a virtue and the need that you actually have for it. You can will to practice it consistently and not yet be virtuous, as when we're trying to improve our characters. If I recognize that, for instance, I eat too much, characteristically, and that I don't yet have the virtue of moderation, at least with respect to food, I can still decide I want to change that. That doesn't mean that just by deciding that I'm automatically there, but that's a step on the way. So moral virtues are really sets of dispositions and skills, having interconnected practical, affective, and intellectual dimensions. So now we get to the part where we talk about specific virtues. And as I thought this through, and I've been thinking about different ways of understanding the virtues for quite some time, as I thought this in terms of SI, I came up with a list of 8. I'm not saying this is the be-all and end-all. This is perfectly open to revision or addition, or there might be reasons why some of these aren't particularly needed. I'm not saying that you have to have these in order to be an SI leader. I'm saying that the possession of these would actually make a person a better SI leader. So I came up with a a list of 7 virtues and one thing that's sort of like virtue, but actually isn't. So the 8 moral traits particularly relevant to SI are justice, moderation, courage, generosity, honesty, good temper, friendliness or compassion, and then self-control, or another way of thinking about that, perseverance. Most of these are virtues that we recognize from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, if you read that back, you know, in an ethics class or in some other class where, I'm not sure who else would assign that, but somebody else does occasionally.
Would you mind reading those slower?
Sure. Well, actually, I'm going to talk about each one in turn.
Okay.
So, okay, so, well, I'll go through this. So, justice, moderation, courage, generosity, honesty, good temper, friendliness or compassion, depending on how you want to render it, and then self-control or perseverance. And then if we add to this Aristotle's other discussed virtue of phronesis or practical wisdom, I think this is a good list that completes what we want to look at. So we have to do more than just name them. This is very often when it comes to talking about virtue, people will put together charts and they'll say, everybody needs to have these qualities, but then they don't actually tell you what are they. What do they consist in? That's why the Nicomachean Ethics is, you know, that thick. It's not just, you know, a one-page list that you see as a poster on somebody's wall. So we need to analyze them. So what is justice? Well, justice is at bottom a habitual disposition to give and take rightly, to give others what is their due, what they deserve, what one ought to give them, and to take from them, or from common resources, one's fair share, not more than one's fair share. Oftentimes the specific shape that justice takes on can be, you know, to some degree expressed by laws or contracts or agreements that we make, but that's only one aspect of justice. One can do what one has agreed to do by following the letter and subverting the spirit. We're all familiar with that sort of thing. What we tend to think of as a work ethic is largely what in ancient and medieval philosophy we would call justice. Actually giving what is due in relation for your wages. Right? Justice also involves treating people fairly in relation to one another, distributing resources in a balanced rather than preferential manner. That's going to be important for an SI leader. So a just SI leader would apportion their time and energy more or less evenly among the students who come to them needing assistance. Doesn't mean that they do it equally necessarily. It means that they do it proportionately. So if some students are in some ways more needy of help, they're going to give them more, but they're not going to shortchange everybody else as a result. Moderation, also called temperance, is a virtue pertains to the uses we make of and the value we assign to bodily pleasures. I just used this as an example of one where I am not where I would like to be. Now this virtue is less likely to be practiced within the context of SI sessions when SI leaders meet with and assist students, and it's going to have much more to do with the larger framework of a student's life. A lot of these things that we're talking about are not going to have a direct impact just in SI. They're broader character-based things. I'm going to actually go through this rather quickly because it looks like we have less time than I had thought. One thing that you can exercise moderation with is time. And that's what we're asking of SI leaders. We're not asking them to avoid bodily pleasures or things like that. We're asking, I mean, that's good if they do, but we're asking them to manage time well. And this actually ties in with another virtue, generosity. Generosity, when Aristotle discusses it, has to do with wealth. It has to do with what you give to people. The generous person gives fairly freely, but they give for the right time, or they give at the right time for the right reasons to the right people. It's not indiscriminate. We would probably want students to be that way too, but not in money, of course. SI leaders aren't doling it out. In time. If you are indiscriminate in your use of money, or indiscriminate in your use of time, in how you spend it, you will invariably have less when you need it to do good things with it. So we want SI leaders who, in short, exercise good time management. Time management is not just an efficiency thing, it's a moral issue, if you look at it from a virtue ethics perspective. I'm going to skip through these rather quickly. I'm going to skip over courage, and I'm going to talk honesty. We're all familiar with the notion of honesty as, telling the truth and stuff like that. Aristotle talks about it, and I think this can be very valuable for SI leaders. Not in terms of just saying that the cup is on the table or things like that. Aristotle says it's telling the truth about oneself, one's abilities, one's good qualities, one's bad qualities. And so the extreme vices are actually boastfulness, sort of arrogance. An SI leader could think that they're much better than everybody else and project that to everybody else. That's not going to be a very useful SI leader. Or self-deprecation. We often think of humble people as automatically being good because they're humble. From a virtue ethics perspective, that's not actually the case. You ought to be humble to the extent that it's, merited within the situation. So the SI leader should be conscious of the fact that they do know more than the other students. They don't know so much more that they can lord it over them, but they can't be a good model if they're not, in some respect, honest about themselves and their achievement, including what their weak points are. I think it makes a person a much more effective SI leader, also a more effective teacher. Students can relate to them easier when you say, yeah, I'm not so good in this. I struggle with this, or I did struggle with this. I'm going to skip over good temper. I think all of you can realize why, patience is a good thing to have with students. And I'm going to talk about how we actually inculcate these. So I'm not actually going to get to all of the virtues. If you want a copy of the paper, I'll have my cards up here, and people can send me an email. If we think about how SI leaders are to identify, understand, practice, and develop these different moral qualities that we'd like them to have, how's that going to take place? One answer is that they will have to do so in the same way as everybody else does. So how does everybody else develop virtues? Intellectual virtues and moral virtues are products not only of teaching, of progressively acquiring, building, and synthesizing knowledge, but also through practice, through acting, feeling, choosing in determinate situations. In the case of a moral virtue, practice plays a much more central, in fact, indispensable role. We become just, Aristotle reminds us, by behaving justly over and over again, until with time and repetition, it becomes a habitual thread woven into the fabric of our character, the composite outcome of myriad choices now settled into a characteristic way of being. One can read, and Aristotle actually says this, all the treatises in moral philosophy that one likes, all the praises of virtuous dispositions, but unless one actually practices choosing and doing actions in accordance with virtue, this knowledge is going to remain inoperative, perhaps even seducing the person into thinking that they have the virtue. So it's not enough just to tell people, here's how you ought to act. We have to find ways to get them to do that, to practice it before they engage students. That said, as educators, we know that if we want students to be able to do something, if we want them to acquire deep structures of skills and dispositions, we not only have to provide them with models and occasions to practice, we actually do have to provide them with instruction. So what we need to do, I'm skipping again a little bit, how do we do this with SI leaders? What else is needed for them to develop or at least recognize the need for and make reasonable progress towards virtuous characters that will be a key constituent in their own pursuit of the good life? There's a clue in Aristotle's dictum that in order to lead well, one must have learned to follow well, to take direction, to do what's asked of one, to understand, then meet and exceed expectations reasonably placed on one. In order for this to occur, they must not only have followed well, they must have been led well. And insofar as they remain students, they must not only continue to follow well to learn, they must continue to be led well and to be taught. So this falls upon the instructor. An SI leader might very well realize a certain virtue is important and necessary for good teaching just by observing their instructor and saying, well, I don't want to end up like that guy. Seeing an instructor losing his or her temper with students and the bad effect. But that's just telling you what not to do. That's not actually guiding you towards what you ought to be doing, what's better to be doing. So when it comes down to it, if virtues are actually needed by SI leaders, instructors are going to have to take on the task of instructing them and guiding them. This in turn is going to require that the instructors themselves, if not virtuous, at least be on the way to virtue and have an adequately developed degree of knowledge of what virtue is and what the virtues would dictate. So this may sound a little utopian, right? Again, do you all have to become professional moral philosophers in order for this to be a possibility? I don't think so. But it would take going beyond the way we typically think about SI, which is largely in terms of very legitimate goals of passing on disciplinary knowledge and accessible outcomes. This is a sort of a broader scope. So it's kind of a large-scale project, which I'm sure is open to many objections, which I'm perfectly willing to entertain now. Nobody's got any objections, or? Yeah.
There was an interesting piece in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago about can the student learn success through failure?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the interesting pieces in this piece, I think, was that a lot of students, or that students who have actually dealt with challenging familial issues, or have really developed those resources of character.
Yeah. Now, things could go one of two ways. Sometimes people face challenges, they respond to them badly, and they end up having bad character as a result, and that makes them less able to respond to situations well. But yeah, you can't, from a virtue ethics perspective, you can't expect people to actually be good who have not been challenged, who haven't faced you can't expect somebody to be just who hasn't actually faced some situations where they were tempted to do the wrong thing, and then somehow ended up doing the right thing, and then keep doing that sort of thing. So there may be something to this notion that sometimes we hold the students' hands a little bit too much. We want them, when they fail, a lot of life is actually figuring out what to do after you screwed things up. How not to screw it up worse. I think virtue ethics is good for that sort of thing. A lot of other ethics just say, hey, don't screw it up. But the reality is we begin very often are thinking about these things after having screwed things up. Does that adequately?
Yeah, it does. I just think, given that SI is what it's like, I think a really interesting way of kind of supporting students who really have had more than their share of challenges.
Yeah.
I just wonder, just to think, another thing to throw out there into that perspective.
And for the SI leader themselves, I think that I would much rather have an SI leader who was a B+ student than an A student, and who would have been a C student if they hadn't put in a lot of work, who struggled with one chapter in particular and can say, yeah, I did poorly on this, and here's how, talking to their fellow students, here's how you're not going to do poorly on this. Because I think people can relate to that better than some, super achiever student who's never screwed up. And the super achiever doesn't usually have much empathy for other students either. So. What else? Everybody's going to now go buy Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics?
I mean, if you're talking about a virtue, you're not defining a virtue, but you're asking for reflection, which is not part of those, 8 and that. While you have those 8 are wonderful, but inability to look back at failure or success.
Yeah.
They play no role.
I'm not saying these are the be-all and end-all. I'm saying that this would add to things. And yeah, reflection, in order to make progress, whether it's just in terms of acquiring disciplinary knowledge or in terms of developing virtues, there has to be an element of reflection. And you can actually talk about people who reflect well and people who don't, and that can also be habitual too. That would be in the category that Aristotle calls the intellectual virtues. And Aristotle actually can't talk about all these things. I mean, we've made plenty of progress since then. But virtue ethics perspective, starting from that and then going on further, I think could. Any other? Okay. Well, thank you very much for entertaining this idea, and hope it's been of some use to you.